The last warning. The first time Daniel Mercer found a silver Mercedes in his parking space, he thought someone had made a mistake. The 5th time he realized it was arrogance. The 11th time he stopped asking. And 3 days later, Evelyn Harrow walked into the underground garage of one of the most expensive residential buildings in the city, saw what had been built around her beloved car, and screamed so loudly that people on the next level heard her. But by then, Daniel had already decided something Evelyn had never expected. If she refused to respect a boundary, he would make the boundary impossible to ignore. Daniel was 34 when he bought apartment 18B in the Ashford. The building was all glass, stone, private elevators and discreet security. The apartments cost more than the houses Daniel had grown up dreaming about. He had spent most of his childhood sharing a bedroom with 2 brothers. His mother had counted grocery money at the kitchen table. His father had worked nights until an injury forced him to stop. Daniel never forgot any of it. Years later, after the software company he had helped build was acquired, Daniel suddenly had enough money to choose where he lived. So he bought the apartment. Then he bought something else. 2 underground parking spaces. P117 and P118. His financial advisor laughed when Daniel mentioned it. "You own 1 car." Daniel shrugged. "I know. So why 2 spaces?" "Because I want 2. That was the entire reason. Maybe he would eventually buy another car. Maybe his mother would visit. Maybe friends would use the second space. Or maybe it would remain empty." Daniel didn't care. He had paid for both spaces separately. They were listed in his property documents. They belonged to him. For 6 months nobody touched them. Then Evelyn Harrow moved into apartment 16A. Evelyn was 68, wealthy, impeccably dressed, and passionately obsessed with cars. She owned several, but the car she drove most often was a silver Mercedes Roadster that looked as if it had never been exposed to dust. The concierge once joked that Evelyn treated the Mercedes better than most people treated their children. It wasn't really a joke. She inspected the paint after every drive. She complained if anyone parked too close. She once demanded security camera footage because she believed someone had leaned against the hood. Her assigned parking space was P094. Unfortunately for Evelyn, P094 sat beside a large concrete pillar. The space was perfectly usable. It simply required careful parking. Evelyn considered that unacceptable. Daniel discovered this on a Thursday evening. He drove into the garage after work, turned toward his spaces and stopped. A silver Mercedes was sitting in P117. His first thought was that management had temporarily reassigned the space. He parked in P118 and went upstairs. The next morning, Daniel spoke to the concierge. "Do you know whose Mercedes is in P117? The concierge hesitated. "Mrs. Harrow. Does she know it's private?" Another hesitation. "Yes." Daniel frowned. "Then why is she parking there?" "She doesn't like her assigned space." Daniel stared at him. The concierge looked embarrassed. "There's a pillar beside it." Daniel almost smiled. "That sounds like her problem. I'll speak with her." Daniel considered the issue finished. 2 nights later, the Mercedes was back. This time he waited until morning. At 7:15, Evelyn appeared. She wore a cream coat, large sunglasses and a silk scarf. She walked toward the Mercedes while searching through her handbag. "Mrs. Harrow?" She turned. "Yes. I'm Daniel Mercer. I own these 2 spaces." He pointed toward P117 and P118. Evelyn looked at the painted numbers. "Oh, I think you accidentally parked in mine." "No accident." Daniel paused. Evelyn pressed her key. The Mercedes lights flashed. "My space is beside a pillar." "I heard. It's too narrow." "I'm sorry." She opened the driver's door. Daniel waited. Evelyn began getting into the car. "Mrs. Harrow." She looked back impatiently. "I need you to stop parking here." Her expression changed. Not to embarrassment. To amusement. "But you have 2 spaces." "Yes." "And 1 car." "Yes." "So what exactly is the problem?" Daniel stared at her for a second. "The problem is that you're parking on property you don't own." Evelyn sighed. "You aren't using it." "I don't need to be using it." She smiled in a way that immediately irritated him. Young man, I think you'll survive. Daniel's voice became firmer. Please use your own space. Evelyn climbed into the Mercedes. Before closing the door, she said, You people become very territorial once you get a little money. Then she drove away. Daniel stood there longer than he intended. It wasn't the insult that bothered him. It was the certainty. Evelyn had not misunderstood him. She simply did not care. 3 days later, Daniel's mother visited. Park in P117, he told her. 10 minutes later she called. There's already a car here. Daniel closed his eyes. Silver Mercedes? Yes. That was warning number 2. Daniel photographed the Mercedes and emailed building management. Management contacted Evelyn. 2 days later the car appeared again. Warning number 3 happened near the elevators. Mrs. Harrow. Evelyn kept walking. You're in my space again. She pressed the elevator button. I was unloading groceries. For 5 hours? She looked at him. Are you monitoring me? No. I'm asking you not to park there. The elevator arrived. Daniel held the door. I'm asking respectfully. Evelyn stepped inside. And I'm respectfully telling you that there are more important things in life. The doors closed. Daniel stood outside. That evening he started taking photographs. Every incident. Every date. Every time. Warning 4. Warning 5. Warning 6. After the 6th time, he placed a printed notice beneath her windshield wiper. Private property. Please do not park in P117 or P118 without permission. The next morning Daniel found the paper on the floor. There was a tire mark across it. He stared at the crumpled warning, then picked it up. He photographed that too. Something changed after that. Until then, Daniel had treated Evelyn like an irritating neighbor. Now he understood that she enjoyed ignoring him. She enjoyed demonstrating that his rules meant nothing to her. Warning number 7 happened in front of the garage manager. Mrs. Harrow, the manager said. P117 belongs to Mr. Mercer. I know. You've been asked repeatedly not to park there. I know that too. Then why are you continuing? Evelyn removed her sunglasses. Because Mr. Mercer doesn't need 2 spaces. Daniel, standing several feet away, nearly laughed. The manager looked confused. That isn't your decision. My vehicle is extremely valuable. My assigned space has a pillar beside it. Then you should speak with management about purchasing another space. There aren't any available. Evelyn looked directly at Daniel. Except apparently there are. Daniel folded his arms. Mine isn't available. Everything is available for the right price. Not this. Don't be childish. Daniel's expression hardened. It's my property. And you're not using it. Daniel stepped slightly closer. This is the 7th time I've warned you. For the first time, Evelyn's smile weakened. You're counting. Yes. The answer seemed to bother her. Then she laughed. Perhaps you should find a hobby. She walked away. Daniel watched her disappear into the elevator. The manager sighed. We can fine her. Will that stop her? The manager didn't answer. Daniel understood immediately. The building could issue notices. They could send emails. They could add small fines to her monthly charges. But nobody wanted a major conflict with Evelyn. And Evelyn knew it. That was her advantage. She had spent decades learning that reasonable people usually became exhausted before unreasonable people did. Warning number 8 changed everything. Daniel returned home around 11 at night. Both of his spaces were occupied. Evelyn's Mercedes sat in P118. A red Porsche sat in P117. Daniel remained in his SUV for several seconds. Then the elevator opened. Evelyn walked out with an older man. When she saw Daniel, she smiled. Oh good. Daniel got out. Whose Porsche? My friend's. You told him to park in my space? The empty one. Daniel looked at her. You gave away my parking space. Evelyn laughed. Don't be dramatic. Daniel pulled out his phone. He photographed both cars. Evelyn's expression changed. What are you doing? Documenting it. Why? Daniel took another photograph. For later. Something about those 2 words disturbed her. Her friend immediately offered to move the Porsche. Evelyn didn't move her Mercedes until the next morning. Warning number 9 happened several days later. Warning number 10 came by certified letter. Daniel's attorney wrote it. The letter clearly stated that P117 and P118 were privately owned, and that Evelyn did not have permission to use either space. It warned her to immediately stop parking there. The letter was delivered at 10:14 Tuesday morning. At 10:32, Daniel received an email. It contained only one sentence. "You should be embarrassed for wasting a lawyer's time on something this pathetic." Daniel saved the email. That evening he entered the garage. The Mercedes was in P117 again. On the dashboard was his attorney's letter. Across the front page, Evelyn had written with thick black marker, "Get a life." Daniel stared through the windshield. Then unexpectedly he smiled. Not because it was funny, because Evelyn had just answered the last question he still had. She wasn't going to stop. No conversation would matter. No letter would matter. No fine would matter. She believed there would never be real consequences because everybody around her would eventually choose peace over confrontation. Daniel took one final photograph, then made a phone call. Northline Construction. "I need temporary barriers installed in a private parking space." The man on the phone paused. "What kind of barriers?" Daniel looked at the Mercedes. "Freestanding. Heavy. Completely inside my property boundary." "What's currently in the space?" "A car." "Your car?" Daniel smiled faintly. "No." 2 days later, representatives from the construction company arrived. Daniel brought copies of his property deed and garage plans. A supervisor named Mateo walked around P117. He looked at the Mercedes, then at Daniel. "You want us to build around this?" "I want temporary barriers positioned within the boundaries of my parking space. We can't damage the vehicle." "I don't want you to. We can't attach anything to the building." "Don't." Mateo studied the measurements. "We can use weighted freestanding panels." "Perfect." Mateo looked at him carefully. "If we put panels on all 4 sides, the car won't be able to leave." Daniel said nothing. Mateo glanced at the Mercedes again. Then he understood. "Oh." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Mateo laughed once. "Bad neighbor. 11 warnings. That bad?" "Worse." Daniel had already notified building management of the temporary installation. Management hated the idea. "Mr. Mercer," the property manager said over the phone, "this will escalate the dispute." "The dispute has already escalated. We could arrange mediation." "What would we mediate?" "Perhaps some kind of compromise." "She has a parking space." "Yes. I have 2. "Yes. She wants mine because she prefers it." The manager went silent. Daniel continued. "There isn't a compromise." The work began that afternoon. One heavy base was placed along the side. Then another. Tall steel-framed panels followed. Nothing touched Evelyn's Mercedes. No paint was scratched. No window was blocked by anything resting against the car. Everything remained inside Daniel's legal space. By early evening, the silver Mercedes sat inside a perfect temporary enclosure. Mateo inspected the final panel. "You know she's going to go insane." Daniel looked at the Mercedes. "I know. How long are you keeping this up?" Daniel glanced at the work order. 30 days. Mateo whistled softly. Then he handed Daniel the paperwork. "Good luck." Daniel smiled. "I think she's the one who needs it." At 7:08 the next morning, Evelyn entered the garage. She was dressed for an appointment. Cream-colored jacket, pearl earrings, sunglasses, leather handbag, Mercedes keys in her right hand. She was looking at her phone as she walked toward P117. Then she slowed. Her phone dropped slightly. Evelyn stopped. For several seconds she didn't move. The parking space was surrounded by metal construction panels. She stepped forward. Through the narrow gaps she saw silver paint. Her Mercedes. Inside. She walked around the enclosure. Once. Then again. No opening. No exit. She grabbed one panel and pulled. It barely moved. Her face changed. "What the hell?" The words echoed across the garage. She shook the barrier harder. "What the hell is this?" A resident several spaces away turned. Evelyn noticed a laminated sign attached to the front. Temporary barrier installation. Private property. 117. Beneath it was the owner's name. Daniel Mercer. Evelyn stared at it, then screamed, "Daniel!" No answer. She immediately called the concierge. "Send maintenance downstairs." "What's wrong?" "Someone has built a cage around my vehicle." There was a pause. "Are you parked in P117? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "That is irrelevant. Mrs. Harrow, P117 belongs to. I know who it belongs to." Her voice cracked through the garage. "I have an appointment. Get these things removed immediately. We'll contact management." "I don't want management contacted. I want someone downstairs." She hung up, then called Daniel. No answer. Again. No answer. Third time. Voicemail. Evelyn looked at the Mercedes through the steel panels. It was close enough to see every reflection on the polished hood, but she couldn't drive it anywhere. Her breathing became faster. Then she called the police. "My car has been deliberately trapped inside a residential garage." 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. By then several residents had stopped to watch. Officer Reyes inspected the barriers. "Is that your vehicle?" "Yes." "And this is your parking space?" Evelyn hesitated. "No." "Who owns it?" Evelyn pointed toward the laminated sign. "Him." "Daniel Mercer?" "Yes." "Did he give you permission to park here?" "That isn't the point." Officer Reyes looked at her. "It matters." Evelyn crossed her arms. "I have parked here many times." "With permission?" Silence. "Did Mr. Mercer ask you not to park here?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. "He made an absurd issue out of an unused parking space." "That wasn't my question." The second officer walked around the enclosure. "No visible damage to the vehicle." Evelyn looked at Reyes. "So remove the barriers. We can't simply dismantle something installed on private property without establishing legal authority to do so. My car is trapped. Was it parked here after you were told not to use this space?" Evelyn didn't answer. Then a calm voice came from behind them. "Yes." Everyone turned. Daniel stood near the elevator, coffee in one hand, a folder in the other. Evelyn's face transformed. "You." Daniel walked closer. "Good morning. Remove this." She pointed violently toward the enclosure. Daniel looked at it. "Why?" "My car is inside." Daniel glanced at the officers. "That is unfortunate. You did this deliberately." Daniel looked directly at her. "Yes." Even Evelyn seemed shocked by the answer. "You admit it?" "I installed barriers inside my parking space." "You trapped my Mercedes." Daniel opened his folder. "No. You parked your Mercedes inside property I repeatedly told you not to use." He handed the documents to Officer Reyes. Photographs, emails, written warnings, certified letter, building records, dates, times, more than 10 separate incidents. Officer Reyes slowly reviewed them. Evelyn watched. Something finally changed in her expression. For the first time, anger gave way to unease. Daniel hadn't snapped. He hadn't acted in a rage. He had prepared. Every time Evelyn laughed at him, Daniel documented it. Every time she ignored a warning, Daniel saved the evidence. Every time she parked in P117, he took another photograph. Daniel looked at her. "You were right about one thing." Evelyn glared. "What?" "I wasn't using the space." He turned toward the steel enclosure. "Now I am." Someone behind them laughed quietly. Evelyn heard it. Her face flushed. "You think you've embarrassed me?" "No." Daniel took back the folder. "I think I've solved my parking problem." Evelyn stepped closer. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Daniel's expression didn't change. "I think I finally do. You're going to regret this." "Maybe." Daniel turned toward the elevator. Evelyn followed him. "What about my car?" "What about it?" "How am I supposed to get it out?" Daniel pressed the elevator button. "That sounds like something you should discuss with management, your attorney, or whoever you want. You're going to remove those barriers." Daniel stepped into the elevator. "How long are they staying?" The doors started closing. Evelyn moved forward. Daniel. He looked at her through the narrowing gap. 30 days. The doors shut. Evelyn remained frozen in the middle of the garage. 30 days. Her Mercedes sat behind the barriers. Untouched. Undamaged. Completely inaccessible. For several seconds Evelyn said nothing. Then she reached for her phone. The expression on her face had changed again. The anger was still there. But now something colder had replaced the shock. Calculation. She scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she had not called in almost 2 years. She pressed it. A man answered after 3 rings. Evelyn. I need a favor. What kind? Evelyn stared at the elevator Daniel had just entered. The kind that makes someone understand he chose the wrong person to humiliate. There was silence on the other end. Then the man asked, Who? Evelyn smiled. Daniel Mercer. And before noon, Daniel would discover that blocking Evelyn's Mercedes had not ended the conflict. It had only given her a reason to stop treating it like a parking dispute. At 6:12 that evening, Daniel stepped into the lobby of the Ashford and immediately knew something was wrong. The concierge wasn't looking at him. 2 residents standing near the elevator suddenly stopped talking. And beside the marble reception desk stood a man in a charcoal suit holding a leather folder. He was waiting. Mr. Mercer? Daniel slowed. Yes. The man approached. My name is Adrian Cole. I represent Mrs. Evelyn Harrow. Daniel almost smiled. Of course she had hired a lawyer. Adrian opened the folder and handed him several pages. Daniel glanced at the first line. Formal notice of claim. Evelyn was accusing him of unlawful interference with her vehicle, harassment, intimidation, emotional distress, and creating a hazardous obstruction inside the garage. The demanded compensation was almost laughable. Almost. Then Daniel saw the number. $185,000. He looked up. Adrian remained expressionless. Mrs. Harrow would prefer to resolve this without litigation. Daniel flipped another page. There was also a demand that the barriers be removed within 24 hours. And if I refuse? She intends to pursue every available remedy. Daniel closed the document. Tell her I'll read it. Adrian's mouth tightened. I suggest you take this seriously. Daniel looked him directly in the eyes. I have been taking this seriously for weeks. Then he stepped into the elevator. Only when the doors closed did his expression change. Because Evelyn had done exactly what he expected. She had escalated. But what bothered Daniel wasn't the lawsuit threat. It was one sentence buried halfway down page 4. The letter claimed Evelyn had been given implied permission to use 117. Daniel read the sentence twice. Then 3 times. That was impossible. He had never given her permission. Not verbally. Not in writing. Not once. So where had that claim come from? At 7:03, Daniel called his attorney Rachel Kim. After reading the document, Rachel went quiet. That implied permission argument is weak, she said. Then why include it? Because they may have something they think supports it. Daniel leaned back. Like what? An email. A witness. Building records. Something. Daniel remembered every conversation with Evelyn. Then he remembered something else. The garage manager. The concierge. Management. People who had repeatedly watched Evelyn use the space before anyone formally intervened. Could Evelyn claim the building tolerated it? Rachel interrupted his thoughts. Don't contact her. I wasn't planning to. And don't remove anything yet. Daniel frowned. You think I should leave the barriers? I think you should do absolutely nothing until I review your ownership documents and building rules. Daniel looked out his apartment window. Far below, traffic moved like thin ribbons of light. Then his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You should have taken the easy way out. Daniel stared at it. Another message arrived. Now this gets expensive. Daniel took screenshots. Then blocked the number. But before he put the phone down, a third message appeared. Enjoy explaining everything to the board tomorrow. Daniel froze. The board? He called the concierge. What happens tomorrow? The concierge hesitated. Mr. Mercer. What meeting? Another pause. The residential board called an emergency session. Daniel's expression hardened. About my parking spaces? About the dispute. Who requested it? The concierge didn't answer. He didn't need to. Evelyn. The meeting began the next morning at 9. 7 board members sat around a polished walnut table. Evelyn sat at one end, Daniel at the other. Adrian Cole sat beside her. Rachel sat beside Daniel. The chairman cleared his throat. We are here because this conflict has begun affecting residents, staff, and building operations. Evelyn leaned forward. My car has effectively been imprisoned. Daniel said nothing. The chairman turned to him. Mr. Mercer, did you knowingly install barriers around Mrs. Harrow's vehicle? Yes. Several board members exchanged looks. Rachel placed a hand lightly on Daniel's arm, warning him not to elaborate. Adrian immediately spoke. My client believes this was retaliatory. Daniel looked at him. It was preventative. Evelyn laughed. You built a cage around my Mercedes. You parked it where you were repeatedly told not to. You had an empty space. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Empty doesn't mean available. The chairman raised his hand. Enough. He opened a folder. Then came the surprise. The board has received a statement indicating Mrs. Harrow believed she had permission to use P117. Daniel looked sharply toward Evelyn. She was smiling. Rachel leaned forward. From whom? The chairman hesitated. Former property manager Thomas Bell. Daniel stared. Thomas Bell had left the Ashford 3 months earlier. The chairman continued. Mr. Bell claims he told Mrs. Harrow that unused spaces were sometimes informally shared between residents. Daniel almost laughed. Sometimes. He apparently suggested she speak with you. I did speak with her. Evelyn interrupted. You never clearly prohibited temporary use until you became obsessive. Daniel turned slowly. Rachel opened Daniel's evidence folder. Actually, we have photographs, emails, notices, and a certified letter showing repeated objections. She placed copies on the table. The room became quieter. One board member began reading. Then another. Evelyn's smile faded slightly. Rachel continued. Mrs. Harrow was warned more than 10 times. Adrian shifted. But then Evelyn did something unexpected. She reached into her handbag and placed a photograph on the table. Daniel recognized it immediately. His stomach tightened. It was P117. But the photograph had been taken months earlier. In the space sat a black Audi belonging to Daniel's friend Marcus. Evelyn pointed at it. He lets other people park there. Daniel stared at her. So clearly this was never about protecting the space. The chairman looked at Daniel. Was that vehicle authorized? Yes. Evelyn leaned forward. Prove it. Silence. Marcus had parked there during a weekend visit. There was no email. No written permission. No record. Daniel saw the trap. Evelyn wasn't trying to prove she had permission. She was trying to blur the difference between a guest and a trespasser. Rachel answered immediately. The owner does not need written contracts with every invited guest. But Daniel was no longer listening. He was staring at the photograph. Something bothered him. The angle. The image had been taken from behind a concrete pillar across the garage. Months before the conflict supposedly became serious. Daniel looked at Evelyn. When was this taken? She paused. Does it matter? Yes. Adrian intervened. We don't need to establish. When was it taken? The room went quiet. Evelyn looked at him. January. Daniel felt a cold sensation crawl down his spine. January. Evelyn had moved into the building in February. Daniel leaned forward. How did you photograph my parking space before you lived here? Nobody moved. Evelyn's face changed. Just slightly. But Daniel saw it. The chairman looked from her to the photograph. Adrian whispered something. Evelyn picked up the picture. Too late. Everyone had heard the question. Daniel repeated it. You moved here in February. Rachel turned toward him. You're sure? Yes. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on Evelyn. That photograph was taken in January. For the first time since the argument began, Evelyn had no answer. The chairman frowned. Mrs. Harrow? She stood. This meeting is becoming ridiculous. Adrian gathered his papers. We'll respond formally. And before anyone could stop them, they left. Daniel watched the door close. Something was wrong. Something much bigger than parking. That afternoon, Daniel searched his emails. Then building notices. Then old resident announcements. Evelyn's official move-in date was February 17th. The photograph's embedded date, visible on the printed image, was January 28th. Nearly 3 weeks earlier, Daniel called Rachel. She was watching the spaces before she moved in. Possibly. Why? Rachel didn't answer. Daniel did. Because she wanted them before she ever arrived. He suddenly remembered something the garage manager had said. There were no available spaces. Except his. Daniel opened his property documents. P117 and P118 had once belonged to apartment 16A. Evelyn's apartment. Daniel stared at the page. Before Daniel purchased them, the original developer had separated the parking rights and sold them independently, which meant Evelyn had bought 16A knowing that its original premium parking spaces had already been sold. To Daniel. Now everything made sense. The photograph. The entitlement. The obsession. Evelyn hadn't randomly chosen P117 because it was convenient. She believed those spaces should have belonged to her apartment. She had wanted them from the beginning. And she had assumed Daniel would eventually surrender one. Daniel was still looking at the deed when someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. He opened the door. An elderly man stood outside. Daniel recognized him. Victor Lane. Former board president. He had lived in the Ashford since it opened. Victor looked down the hallway, then back at Daniel. You need to be careful. Daniel frowned. About Evelyn? Victor nodded. She tried to buy those spaces before you did. Daniel felt his suspicion harden into certainty. Victor continued. When the developer refused to reverse your purchase, she was furious. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because everyone assumed it was finished. Victor looked toward the elevator. It wasn't. Daniel stepped closer. What else? Victor hesitated, then lowered his voice. Evelyn didn't call Adrian Cole today because of the barriers. Daniel stared. She called him months ago. The hallway suddenly seemed much quieter. What for? Victor's expression became serious. To find a way to take those spaces away from you. And downstairs, at that exact moment, Evelyn Harrow was meeting with someone Daniel had trusted from the beginning. Someone who had access to the building's property records. Someone who knew exactly how Daniel had acquired P117 and P118. And someone who had just agreed to help Evelyn prove that one of those parking spaces had never legally belonged to Daniel at all. Daniel didn't sleep that night. At 2:17 a.m., the documents for P117 and P118 covered his dining table. Deeds. Purchase agreements, building plans, bank transfers, emails. Everything appeared legitimate. Yet Victor Lane's warning kept repeating in his head. Someone was helping Evelyn prove one of the spaces had never legally belonged to him. At 8 the next morning, Rachel arrived. Daniel pushed the documents toward her. Find the weakness. Rachel spent 40 minutes reading before stopping at one page. Her expression changed. What? She turned the document around. This. It was an amendment signed when Daniel purchased the apartment. It transferred both parking spaces to him. Daniel saw nothing unusual. Rachel pointed toward the bottom. 2 signatures were required from the developer. There was only one. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. You're saying I don't own P117? I'm saying someone may argue the transfer was defective. But I paid for it. I know. The building registered it under my name. I know. Then how can one missing signature suddenly matter? Rachel leaned back. Because someone went looking for a technical defect. Daniel immediately thought of Evelyn. She hadn't simply hired a lawyer after the barriers went up. She had been preparing before that. Perhaps for months. Then Daniel's phone rang. Building management. Mr. Mercer, we need you downstairs. Why? A pause. There are contractors in the garage. Daniel stood. What contractors? They're removing your barriers. Daniel reached P117 less than 3 minutes later. 4 workers were dismantling the enclosure. Evelyn stood nearby. Adrian Cole was beside her. And next to Adrian stood building manager Charles Wynne, the man Daniel had trusted to enforce the rules from the beginning. Stop! The workers turned. Daniel walked toward Charles. Who authorized this? Charles avoided his eyes. The board received legal notice disputing your ownership of P117. So, until the dispute is resolved, the area must be returned to its previous condition. Daniel looked at Evelyn. She smiled. Not broadly. She didn't need to. The message was obvious. I told you. Rachel arrived moments later. You have no authority to determine ownership, she told Charles. We aren't determining anything. You're removing my client's property. For safety reasons. Daniel suddenly laughed. Everyone looked at him. There it was again. The pattern. Every time Evelyn wanted something, somebody discovered a new reason why giving it to her was supposedly necessary. Safety. Convenience. Procedure. Daniel walked toward the Mercedes. The front barrier had already been removed. Evelyn pressed her key. The lights flashed. For the first time in days she could drive away. She approached Daniel. Was it worth it? He looked at her. Was what worth it? All this. She gestured around the garage. You could have simply behaved like a neighbor. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. You parked in my space 11 times. And look where your obsession got you. Evelyn leaned closer. You should learn something about expensive buildings, Daniel. What? Buying something and controlling it aren't always the same thing. She entered her Mercedes. Daniel watched her reverse. Before driving away, Evelyn lowered the window. Oh, MP118? Daniel's expression changed. What about it? Her smile widened. You might want to check that paperwork too. She drove away. Daniel didn't move. Rachel looked at him. She wants you frightened. Daniel watched the Mercedes disappear up the ramp. No. He turned toward Charles. She wants me distracted. That afternoon Daniel did something Evelyn hadn't expected. He stopped investigating her. Instead, he investigated Charles Wynne. Building records showed Charles had become manager 14 months earlier. Before that, he had worked for a property management company called Beaumont Residential. Daniel searched the name, then froze. One of Beaumont's former directors was Adrian Cole, Evelyn's attorney. Daniel called Rachel. You need to see this. Within an hour they had another connection. Adrian had represented Beaumont during several property disputes. Charles had worked under him. And 6 months before Evelyn purchased apartment 16A, Charles had requested access to archive development records for the Ashford, including parking space transfers. Rachel stared at the dates. This predates Evelyn moving in. Daniel nodded. So somebody was researching my spaces before she arrived. But why? Daniel looked toward the garage plans. That's the question we've been asking wrong. He placed P117 and P118 side by side. Maybe this was never about getting one convenient parking space. Rachel frowned. What else would it be about? Daniel didn't know. Not yet. Then an email arrived from Victor. Only 3 words. Call me outside. Daniel went across the street before dialing. Victor answered immediately. Don't talk inside the building. Why? Because Charles has access to security records. Daniel's eyes moved toward the Ashford. What do you know? Victor lowered his voice. Those parking spaces weren't originally designed as ordinary spaces. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? When the Ashford was built, the developer planned a private garage extension behind P117 and P118. Daniel remembered the wall behind his spaces. Bare concrete. Victor continued. The project was abandoned. But there's still something behind that wall. What? A secured storage room. Daniel stared across the street. Why would Evelyn care about an old storage room? Victor went silent. Then said, because her husband owned it. Daniel felt cold. He knew Evelyn was widowed. He hadn't known her husband had any connection to the Ashford. Her husband died 9 years ago, Victor continued. Before this building officially opened. What was inside? I don't know. Who does? Thomas Bell, the former property manager. The same man who had suddenly claimed Evelyn believed she had permission to use P117. Daniel understood. P117 wasn't the destination. It was access. He thanked Victor and ended the call. Then he immediately went underground. The garage was quiet. Daniel walked toward his spaces. P117 was empty now. He studied the concrete wall behind it. He had parked there hundreds of times without noticing anything unusual. Then he saw it. A thin rectangular outline beneath several layers of gray paint. A door. It had been sealed into the wall. Daniel moved closer. Near the bottom was a small metal plate. Most of the lettering had been painted over. He scraped the surface carefully with a coin. 3 characters appeared. 16A. Evelyn's apartment. Daniel stepped backward. Suddenly every confrontation looked different. She hadn't chosen his parking space because of the pillar. She needed access to this wall. And Daniel's ownership stood in her way. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. A photograph appeared. Daniel opened it. His blood ran cold. The picture had been taken only seconds earlier. It showed Daniel standing in front of the hidden door. Someone was photographing him from somewhere inside the garage. Then a message appeared. Walk away from the wall. Daniel slowly looked around. Nothing. Rows of cars. Concrete pillars. Security cameras. Then another message. This is your final warning. Daniel almost smiled at the irony. For weeks, Evelyn had ignored his warnings. Now someone was warning him. He typed, "What's behind it?" The reply came instantly. "Something that doesn't belong to you." Daniel stared at the screen. Then footsteps echoed behind him. He turned. Charles Wynne stood near the elevator. "Mr. Mercer." Daniel slipped his phone into his pocket. Charles's eyes moved toward the wall. "You shouldn't be down here." Daniel glanced around. "In my own parking space?" Charles didn't answer. Daniel pointed toward the painted outline. "What's behind that door?" For 1 second, Charles's professional expression vanished. Fear. Daniel saw it. Then Charles recovered. "Nothing. You're a terrible liar." Charles stepped closer. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever Victor Lane told you, leave this alone." That confirmed everything. Daniel stared at him. So Victor was right. Charles realized his mistake. Too late. What did Evelyn's husband put in there? Charles's face hardened. "You don't understand what you're involved in." "Then explain it." "I can't." "Can't." Daniel stepped closer. "Or won't." Charles looked toward the nearest camera, then lowered his voice. "If you open that room, Evelyn won't be your biggest problem." He walked away. Daniel remained motionless. 5 minutes later, Rachel arrived. He showed her the door. Then the messages. Rachel read them twice. "We should document everything and handle this carefully." Daniel nodded, but his attention was on the wall. Because there was one detail Charles hadn't realized Daniel had noticed. When Charles walked away, a keycard had briefly slipped from his jacket pocket. Printed across it were the words, "Ashford Development, lower storage access." Charles had access. That night, Daniel checked his door camera before going to bed. At 1:43 a.m. Motion triggered it. A figure stood outside his apartment. The person's face was hidden beneath a hood. They placed an envelope on the floor and left. Daniel waited before opening the door. Inside the envelope was an old photograph. Evelyn, much younger. Beside her stood her late husband. Behind them was the Ashford under construction. And visible between them was the open storage room behind P117. Inside the room stood several large metal cases. On the back of the photograph someone had written, "Ask Evelyn what her husband hid before he died." Daniel turned the photograph over again. Only then did he notice the third person reflected in the polished surface of one of the cases. A younger Charles Wynne. Daniel stared at the reflection. Charles hadn't merely discovered Evelyn's secret. He had been there when it began. And downstairs, behind a sealed door Daniel technically owned access to, something had been waiting for 9 years. Something Evelyn was apparently willing to manipulate lawyers, building records, and property ownership to retrieve. At 8:06 the next morning, Daniel received a message from Evelyn. "We need to talk." Alone. Daniel stared at it. After weeks of insults, lawyers, and threats, Evelyn suddenly wanted privacy. He replied, Garage. 9 o'clock. She arrived exactly on time. No sunglasses today. No smile either. Daniel held up the old photograph. For the first time since they had met, Evelyn looked genuinely frightened. Where did you get that? Someone left it outside my apartment. Who? I was hoping you'd tell me. She reached for it. Daniel pulled it back. What did your husband hide behind that wall? Evelyn's eyes hardened. This is none of your business. You made it my business when you started trying to take my property. This was never supposed to happen. What wasn't? Evelyn looked toward the security camera, then surprised him. Not here. She walked toward the stairwell. Daniel followed. Once the heavy door closed behind them, Evelyn spoke quietly. My husband, Richard, invested in the Ashford before construction was completed. So Victor told me. He didn't tell you everything. Daniel waited. Evelyn swallowed. Richard discovered money was disappearing from the project. How much? Millions. Daniel's expression changed. Evelyn continued. Fake contractors. Inflated invoices. Companies that existed only on paper. And the metal cases? Records. Daniel frowned. You've spent all this time fighting over parking spaces because you want accounting records? Not just records. Her voice dropped. Richard copied everything. Contracts. Payments. Names. Charles. Evelyn looked at him. Charles was working for one of the contractors. Daniel remembered the photograph. Then why is he helping you? He isn't. That stopped Daniel. Evelyn stepped closer. Daniel, I didn't send those messages warning you away from the wall. Then who did? You already know. Charles. Daniel studied her. You lied about having permission to use P117. Yes. You tried to undermine my deed. Yes. You used Adrian. Yes. Each admission came without excuse. Daniel shook his head. Why not simply tell me? Evelyn laughed bitterly. Would you have believed me? After 11 warnings? Probably not. For once she had no comeback. Then Daniel asked the question that mattered. Why now? Your husband died 9 years ago. Evelyn looked down. Because I only learned 6 months ago that the room still existed. Daniel suddenly understood the photograph from January. You were investigating before you bought 16A. Yes. And you bought the apartment for access. Yes. The pillar was nonsense. Mostly. Despite everything, Daniel almost laughed. Evelyn didn't. Richard died in a car accident 3 days after telling me he'd collected evidence. Daniel's smile disappeared. The police ruled it accidental? Yes. But you don't believe that. Evelyn stared at him. I stopped believing it years ago. A noise sounded outside the stairwell. Both went silent. Footsteps. Then nothing. Daniel opened the door. The garage was empty. But P117 wasn't. A black van was parked across it. 2 men were standing beside the hidden wall. And Charles Wynne was with them. Hey! Charles turned. One of the men immediately grabbed a tool case. Daniel started forward. Charles shouted, Don't! Too late. The second man struck the painted section of wall with a demolition hammer. Concrete cracked. Evelyn ran from the stairwell. What are you doing? Charles saw her and went pale. You shouldn't be here. Another strike. A section of plaster collapsed. Behind it appeared an old steel door. Evelyn froze. 9 years. 9 years of doubt, suspicion and unanswered questions stood 10 meters away. Open it, she whispered. Charles looked at her. Go upstairs, Evelyn. No. I'm giving you one chance. Daniel took out his phone. Charles noticed. Put that away. Daniel continued recording. Why? One of the men moved toward him. Daniel backed away. Touch me and this becomes a very different morning. The man stopped. Evelyn stepped between them. Charles, where are Richard's files? Charles's face changed. Not fear anymore. Exhaustion. You still think Richard was innocent? Evelyn stared. What? Charles laughed quietly. You spent 9 years turning him into a martyr. Don't say his name. He wasn't exposing the scheme, Evelyn. Silence. Charles looked directly at her. He was part of it. Evelyn's face drained of color. No. Richard didn't collect those documents to expose anyone. He collected them as insurance. You're lying. I helped him put the cases in that room. Evelyn staggered backward. Daniel watched her anger collapse into something far worse. Doubt. Charles continued. Richard knew investigators were getting close. He hid copies so he could negotiate if the others betrayed him. Evelyn whispered. His accident. Charles said nothing. That silence was terrifying. Suddenly one of the workers shouted. Got it. The steel door opened. Everyone turned. The room beyond was dark. Daniel switched on his phone flashlight. Dust floated through the beam. Empty shelves lined the walls. And in the center, nothing. No metal cases. Evelyn rushed inside. No. She searched behind shelves. Nothing. No. Charles entered slowly. His confusion looked real. They were here. Daniel studied the floor. Dust covered almost everything, except 4 rectangular areas. Someone had removed the cases recently. Very recently. Daniel crouched. Fresh wheel marks crossed the dust toward the doorway. These were moved. Charles looked down. When? Daniel followed the marks. Then noticed something beneath an old cabinet. A small black object. He reached for it. A USB drive. Evelyn stared. Charles lunged. Don't. Daniel grabbed it first. Charles stopped. That reaction told Daniel everything. You know what's on this. Charles's face tightened. Give it to me. No. Daniel, you have no idea. A loud alarm suddenly erupted throughout the garage. Fire alarm. Red lights flashed. The workers looked toward the exit. Then the garage lights died. Darkness. Evelyn screamed. Daniel felt someone slam into him. His phone hit the floor. A hand grabbed his wrist. Another reached for the USB. Daniel twisted away. Get off me. Footsteps thundered through the darkness. Then emergency lights activated. Charles was gone. So were the 2 workers. The black van was still there. Evelyn stood against the wall, breathing hard. Daniel checked his hand. Empty. The USB drive had disappeared. Damn it. Then Evelyn pointed. Daniel. On the dusty floor lay his phone. Beside it was something Charles had dropped during the struggle. A keycard. Daniel picked it up. It wasn't for the Ashford. Across the front was the name of a private storage company. Below it, Unit 417. Evelyn stared at the card. The cases. Daniel looked toward the empty room. Maybe. His phone suddenly rang. Rachel. He answered. Daniel, where are you? Garage. You need to get out of there. Why? Rachel's next words made him stop breathing. I found Thomas Bell, the former property manager, the man who supposedly supported Evelyn's claim. Daniel gripped the phone. And he never gave that statement. Daniel looked at Evelyn. Rachel continued. His signature was forged. Daniel's eyes moved toward the open steel room. By whom? I don't know. But there's more. What? Thomas says someone paid him 3 months ago to hand over archived security footage from the Ashford. Daniel felt cold. Footage of what? Rachel went silent for a second, then answered. Your parking spaces. Daniel looked at P117. Why? Because the footage shows who removed those metal cases. Evelyn stepped closer. Daniel put Rachel on speaker. Who was it? Rachel exhaled. It wasn't Charles. Silence filled the garage. Then who? Rachel said the name. Daniel slowly turned toward Evelyn. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't sure whether the frightened older woman standing beside him was a victim, or the person who had been lying better than everyone else. Rachel's voice came through the phone. It was Evelyn. Daniel stared at her. Evelyn closed her eyes. I can explain. The footage showed her removing the metal cases months earlier. The parking dispute had been a distraction. She wanted legal control of P117 so nobody could question why she kept returning to the hidden room. What was inside? Daniel asked. Evidence against Richard and others, Evelyn whispered. I couldn't let Charles destroy it. She had already delivered copies to investigators. Weeks later, Charles and 2 former developers were arrested over fraud and evidence tampering. Richard's role was exposed too, destroying the heroic version of him Evelyn had protected for years. Evelyn sold 16A soon afterward. Before leaving, she met Daniel in the garage. "I'm sorry," she said, looking at P117. "For all of it." Daniel handed her the final parking fine management had issued. "You still owe $80. For the first time, Evelyn laughed. She paid it. Months later, Daniel bought a second car. He parked it in P117. Standing between his 2 vehicles, he remembered how everything had begun, with one woman convinced an empty space belonged to whoever wanted it most. Daniel smiled. The strangest part wasn't what had been hidden behind the wall. It was the lesson Evelyn had learned too late. An empty space is not an invitation, and a quiet man is not a man without limits.